Welcome to the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randle and Gus Kearns.
We've talked about teams in college basketball that move the needle, and today we'll discuss the Indiana Hoosiers, who are right at the top of that list. When you talk Duke, Kentucky, UCLA, Indiana is right at that level. Whether it's Bob Knight, whether it's the trip to the finals with Mike Davis, the 5 NCAA titles, the 8 Final Fours. When you talk about basketball history, you're always going to bring up the Hoosiers. But since that appearance in the national championship game back in 2002, the Hoosiers program has not been at the same level of those elite schools. From 2002 until 2012, that entire decade, they did not make a Sweet 16. They made it in 2012. They made it again in 2013. Then they made it in 2016, losing to number 1 seed North Carolina. But they haven't been back since. And they hired Archie Miller, who had tremendous success over at Dayton. Hardworking, blue collar, roll up your sleeves, play tough defense, exactly the type of guy you think would succeed in Indiana. But as Archie Miller enters next year, which will be his 4th season, opinions are mixed on his success. First year 16 and 15, second year 19 and 16, this year 20 and 12. Incomplete season, one in which they probably would have made the NCAA tournament because of a bevy of home victories in the best conference in the country, the Big Ten. But year 4 is going to be very important for Archie Miller. You can't go to Indiana, get players the caliber of a Romeo Langford, who was only there for 1 year, and now Trayce Jackson-Davis, and not have deep success in the NCAA tournament and success in the Big Ten Conference. Michigan State, Michigan, Iowa, Illinois, now tremendous. Ohio State, Minnesota's always tough, especially at home. The list goes on. And so this coming year is critical for Archie Miller and the Hoosier faithful. If they see a 4th straight improvement, then they'll make the NCAA tournament and probably be pretty darn good. Because once you talk about 22, 23 wins in the Big Ten, that's legit. But we have to see what's going to happen. And today we bring on an expert on Indiana basketball, Zach Osterman. Zach covers IU athletics and college sports for the IndyStar. Also has his own podcast, Mind Your Banners. And Zach's going to come on today to break down the season, the ups, the downs, the dominance at home, the struggles on the road, and where most Hoosier fans think this program is headed. We'll talk about the players coming in next year. They just signed a big one for 2021, 2022. So Archie Miller's making inroads even in the future. But the question is, how is this year going to go? Zach Osterman, expert on the Hoosiers, is going to come in and give us a few minutes here on the Screener season recap series. My partner Gus and I have banged out about 20 podcasts for you, going team by team. We're going to continue with these. Big schools, small schools. All we ask is that you listen. You drop us a 5-star rating and review if you really enjoyed it there on iTunes or wherever you listen to our podcast. We appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter at SDS Podcast, myself at Randle Rant, my partner at CKearns12. We're here trying to fill the void that has been left by COVID-19 for you college basketball junkies out there. And today we head to Bloomington, Indiana, and bring on the Hoosier expert, Zach Osterman. Follow him on Twitter at Zach Osterman. Let's bring him now and talk IU basketball. The Screener season review series rolls on, and we head to Bloomington, Indiana for one of the storied college basketball programs, the Indiana Hoosiers. Today we're going to bring in Zach Osterman, who covers IU athletics and college sports for the IndyStar. Also has his own great podcast, Mind Your Banners, where he discusses all things about the IU Hoosiers. A must follow on Twitter at Zach Osterman, Osterman, and he joins us for a few minutes here to recap the Hoosier season and preview next year, a big year for Archie Miller and the Hoosiers. Zach, thanks so much for joining us today. Are you staying safe? How you doing out there in Indiana?
No, thanks for having me. It helps pass a little time here working from home in one of the weirder off seasons I can remember.
Yeah, how's it going out there in Indiana? I guess is it affecting you? And you're probably just quarantined like everyone else, right?
The funny thing is this would obviously be my downtime anyway, from the perspective of, even if Indiana had gone to the Final Four, the season would be over. I'd kind of be into postseason mode, off-season mode, taking a breath, taking a rest. But of course, in a way, that's what we're all doing. But in a way, it's also kind of trying to wrap our arms around this uncertainty. Did a big piece last week about just kind of the, frankly, stark financial ramifications of like losing the football season, to athletics departments like Indiana's. And then obviously there's also the fact that my wife's working from home and we have a 2-year-old here. So normally it's just me and the dogs, me and the dogs and the cats, which is less chaotic than you'd think during the day. But you throw a 2-year-old into that, and all of a sudden it sort of turns into one of those science project volcanoes. It erupts pretty fast.
They're the great variables. I have 2 kids myself, and at this point they're like, who are we talking to today? We had Kentucky, Kansas. I said, Indiana today. We're going to do the Hoosiers. Okay, good. Sounds good. So they look forward to it. So I'm curious, Zach, coming into this year, what were your thoughts on Indiana? Preseason poll had them 10th. Archie Miller's 3rd season there at Indiana. But coming in, what were your thoughts on how the team was going to do? And then we'll get into how the season actually went.
It's funny. I think the season kind of went the way, and as somebody who gets it wrong a lot, both in terms of prospecting Indiana and also just college basketball generally, this was kind of the rare season that played out roughly like I thought it would. Looking at Indiana in the preseason, on the one hand, there was a lot of returning talent. You knew they had or a lot of returning players, I guess you should say. They had a very good freshman big man, Trayce Jackson-Davis, coming in. They were going to be a little bit older than they'd been in Archie's 2nd season. But, and I said this in a variety of ways, what feels like 5 years ago now in the preseason, that, most teams don't get better for losing 2 such dominant players as Romeo Langford and Juwan Morgan when you talk about the points, the rebounds, the possessions that they use, just all of the things that statistically they accounted for Indiana last year, I guess now 2 years ago, 2 seasons ago. You still sort of were skeptical of just how Indiana replaced that in just the pure tonnage of it all. And then you added to that the fact that really the only, Indiana did return a fair number of players last season, but really the only guy that would have began this season just passed in a role similar to what he played the season before that was Rob Finney, Indiana's point guard. So you also had a lot of guys stepping into newer roles, bigger roles, maybe being asked to score more, or rebound more, or take on tougher defensive covers, things like that. But you also still felt like this was a team that if it could gel together defensively in particular, it could be a team that in a tough Big Ten could win enough games to get to the NCAA tournament. And ultimately that's what it did. Or at least I think we can probably safely say that's what it would have done had there been an NCAA tournament. But, that's not to say the entire season was perfectly linear. It wasn't a straight sort of path upward in terms of, development and results. There were still some kind of staggering moments, some steps back. Maybe some questions left unanswered going forward for Archie and his staff. But broadly speaking, for the 3rd straight year for Archie Miller, it's more wins than the previous season. It's, if you look at, if like me, you like the tempo-free stats and Kim Pomeroy, things like that, it's the 3rd straight season of improvement in national rankings offensively and defensively in a lot of those areas. And again, I think it would have been a season in the NCAA tournament. And so then you're at least allowed to kind of say, okay, these first 3 years have been, kind of this rebuilding process. Now that's over. And now the question is, how strong of a foundation has Archie built for himself to kind of, launch on from here and take more tangible steps up the ladder?
That's probably right on the money. It got to the ending that I think we thought it would get, but it wasn't linear. That's a great way to refer to it. And as the season went on, they started very strong, 11-1, had the loss to Wisconsin away on December 7th. Then they beat Nebraska in overtime at home, which was certainly a big win. And then after that, the loss to Arkansas, I saw that game. That was a tough one. Isaiah Joe got hot there. Then Maryland. But then they had some real great wins at home. And listen, Assembly Hall is always a difficult place to play. But that was why it was hard for us, particularly over here in the East Coast, to get a read on them. Home wins over Michigan State, right? Home win over Ohio State. Home win over Iowa. Home win over Penn State. And the struggles on the road. But like you said, they had in the Big Ten Conference tournament a big 25-point win over Nebraska. They were 20-12 overall, 9-11 in conference. I think they were in. I agree with you. But like you said, it probably was like a heart rate monitor, really was for the Hoosiers fans, because at home, they were dominant.
Yeah, and then you talk about, listen to, the away results. Some of those Big Ten away losses weren't even really close. Wisconsin, they were down by 30 at one point, or maybe even 31. Maryland, they were down by 30. I think Rutgers at one point, they only lost by 9, but they were down as much as 17. Penn State, they were down 20. Ohio State, they were down 19. And then there's, it all kind of culminates with that Michigan game on February 16th where they lose by 24, and that was never a game. And so there was still an element, there was still a feeling that at times this team did have a little bit of a glass jaw, that particularly when it lost its way a little bit defensively, because it wasn't a group that could produce just sort of instant offense. You didn't have a guy on this team that could break anybody and everybody down off the dribble and create his own shot, or just kind of be sort of a one-man offensive set with the way that he could disrupt a defense. You didn't have, obviously, a ton of three-point shooting. Indiana, actually, it's IU's best three-point shooting number as a team under Archie Miller, and it's still only 32.6% on the season. So there were a lot of, there were times where kind of the offense would dry up, and what Indiana would need was to really dig in defensively and use defense, that old coaching cliche of using defense to create offense. And if they lost touch there, and I think you saw that against Maryland, I think you saw that, frankly, a little bit at home against Arkansas, you certainly saw that, at Ohio State, at Michigan, then they could really, just kind of get floored by a couple good punches and not be able to get back up until the game was, effectively over. And so that's maybe one of those things that you talk about, what still needs to develop, where this program still needs to go as it gets older, number one. And, presuming that Archie Miller, kind of gets it right in recruiting and development, more talented, number two, that's one of the things you need to eliminate. But I think you also look at it and, you look at just the total number of this team's quality wins. You mentioned all the home wins. You can go back to Ohio State, to Florida State, winning at Minnesota. In fact, sweeping Minnesota on the season, wins that I know Minnesota wound up with a pretty mediocre record, but wins that the computer, rankings really would have liked. And the other thing, too, is, another thing where if you kind of look at things like the KenPom numbers, and I enjoy just using Ken Pomeroy's database as kind of a reference point or a guide, every year under Archie Miller now, Indiana's worst loss has gotten better and better. So you look back to, as 3 seasons ago, Indiana's losing to Indiana State and Fort Wayne at home, big, which obviously is a real system shock for a place like this. And then even last year, losing games like Northwestern, losing at Rutgers, and that's not a Rutgers team. They're 2 years ago, excuse me. Still doesn't quite feel like the season's finished sometimes, but
it's true.
2 years ago, losing at Rutgers is still a pretty tough loss to take from an NCAA perspective. Well, the Indiana's worst loss this year is a KenPom top 50 loss at home to an Arkansas team that, you mentioned Isaiah Joe was in really good NCAA tournament shape itself until Joe gets hurt in February. So, by committee standards, that's not even really a bad loss. The point is, you mentioned the heart rate monitor. There were a lot of times where this team had Indiana fans living on the edge of this season, and there were certainly a number of times that this team did things that were worth the criticism Indiana fans would send their way. But when you look at it in the aggregate, there are a lot of good wins. There aren't really any bad losses, at least from a rankings and NCAA tournament perspective. And you're at least, I think, allowed to say, okay, this is progress. Now, at some point, 20-12 stops being progress, obviously, for a coach in a place like Indiana. But in year 3, I think it still is.
Now, the players that are leaving, Deron Davis, Devante Greene, I would say I really underrated Greene coming into the year. And in many ways, Zach, he was the barometer of this team. You mentioned the Florida State win, the big win over Iowa. He had 30 points against Florida State, was on fire, 27 against Iowa. I saw him really take a huge step forward. Was that expected by you? And if so, then who do you think can be the player next year that could maybe step into that role? Because I really felt Trayce Jackson-Davis, obviously extremely solid inside. We'll get to him in a bit. But Greene, I thought, really elevated this team when he could put the ball in the basket there during a game on a consistent basis.
I think he did. I think, the one issue you always had a little bit with Devante Greene was, and Archie, I don't think there's a player on this roster, Archie Miller, would talk more openly about kind of the, dealing with psychologically than Devante Greene, in terms of saying, Archie would say many times that it was just really easy for Devante Greene to get down on himself. And that one of the big challenges was to get Devante to be one of those players that very much embraced the idea that, worry about playing well defensively, and a lot of the offensive stuff will just naturally take care of itself without you thinking about it too much about it. Whereas, I think on a lot of nights you did see Devante Greene, kind of being a player that, needed to see a couple shots go down. And, for a guy who's a good offensive player, but, he only shoots 35.8% from three, 37.6% on twos. It's not like he could count on being a high volume guy every single night. There were times when he could be frustrating, but there were also times when, you mentioned the Iowa game. That's a game where Luka Garza, I'm just looking back at the box score right now, scores 38 points on 22 shots, and Iowa loses that game by double figures and is never really in it. And in no small part because Devante Greene scores 27 points. Indiana doesn't beat Ohio State without him. Indiana certainly doesn't beat Florida State, obviously, without him. Indiana, it's weird because Devante Greene winds up moving to the bench for most of the Big Ten season, and yet I think that as Indiana gets a little bit more consistent about if you kind of remove the Michigan game from Iowa on, Indiana's performances are a lot more consistent, even if the results are still a little bit uneven. And you get a lot of pretty consistent performances from Devante Greene. His quietest game, removing Michigan, where frankly everybody on this team played poorly in that stretch from February 13th to the end of the game. He only scores 8 points at home against Minnesota, but he's also got 3 assists and only 1 turnover. I think there were times when Devante Greene too, if you want to talk more about the intangibles, Indiana fans could get frustrated with him. It's his penchant for turnovers and maybe trying high risk plays that could be high reward plays if they came off. Sometimes, kind of overstated the fact that his turnover numbers weren't that bad and his assist rate numbers were pretty good. But he could be kind of the one player that if there was one guy that was willing to try and be instant offense for this team, it was Devante Greene. And to your question about kind of how Indiana replaces him, I don't know that there's an immediate answer to that. And I don't know that that's necessarily something that you look at and say, well, Indiana's going to be a lot weaker next year, because the flip side to that is Indiana returns 3 guards off of this year's roster. It could add a 5-star point guard in Christian Lander if he reclassifies. Its wing play will be better next year. If Trayce Jackson-Davis comes back, its post play will probably be even better next year. But the one thing that, statistically nobody else in this team had was the ability to just kind of be his own offense at times. Devante Greene hit something like 30%. I want to say about 30% of his made 3-pointers were unassisted. So they were pull-up shots, primarily. Nobody else was anywhere near that number. And so, it didn't, every once in a while it could frustrate fans. There's no question Devante's playing style, but it did bring Indiana something that really nobody else could. And there were nights, to your point, where, I think Archie Miller kind of said, hey, we're going to ride the highs and lows a little bit because this guy can get us going when not a lot else is. When you talk about, people who individually lost opportunities, Devante Greene was, I think, 46 points away from 1,000 for his career. He'd never played in the NCAA tournament, and I think it'd be tough on, someone like him to lose that opportunity. But to be honest with you, I don't think there is a ready-made replacement. There's not if there's a Devante Greene sized hole in the roster, there's not somebody that you just paper right in there in the offseason. I think you're almost kind of looking for things for offense to come in different ways, because on his best nights, Devante Greene could be one of those guys that just caught fire from nowhere.
Yeah, he was flammable. He was the flammable player. That's a skill. The microwave, old Detroit Piston days, Vinnie Johnson used to heat up. That's the skill that he had, and you could ride him for sure. You mentioned Trayce Jackson-Davis, the big kid inside. Phenomenal freshman year. Great touch around the basket. 13.5 points, 8.5 rebounds. What are you hearing about Jackson-Davis? A lot of players now starting to come out and decide, I'm going to test the waters, this or that. Certainly him returning, I think, is a game changer, Zach. What are you hearing about Trayce Jackson-Davis?
It's funny, nothing really. And I think by now we all kind of expect it to. And under normal circumstances, I think you'd expect him to at least declare and go through the process, get some feedback, see where he stands. I'd heard, and I guess initially kind of went along with this line of thinking that more players might declare, thinking, well, can I risk there not being a college basketball season next winter? Because of all this uncertainty, just getting an opportunity to start my pro career wherever it is, whatever it is. Should I take that, should I just take that leap now? I think the flip side to that is, and this is something that I've kind of I guess a conclusion I've arrived at as I've thought about it more, is that for somebody like Trayce Jackson-Davis, who's not appearing, in mock drafts right now, who's kind of at the fringe of top 100s, and, through the season when I'd see NBA people I knew, I'd just have very informal conversations with them, and they didn't feel like he was quite, at that NBA cut yet. They thought he could be, but they just weren't sure it would be after this year. The guy like that, how much, if you can't do in-person stuff in the pre-draft process, and I think right now it feels like pretty much nobody can, or if they can, it will be very, very, very limited and very strict. Is there value in declaring? Because if essentially you're just going to declare so that you can have some Zoom calls with, a few NBA scouts, or some front office type people, maybe send some workout tape around, and then you get some feedback. Maybe it's worth it, but maybe it's also worth it to just put your head down and say, I know I'm coming back for my sophomore year. Obviously, we're still, right kind of in the heart of the calendar for guys declaring and figuring out what they want to do with the process. So it wouldn't surprise me if we saw him declare, at least just to get some feedback and then retain his eligibility in return. But at this point, if you're asking me to kind of handicap it, it seems more likely than not to me that Trayce Jackson-Davis is back for his sophomore season at IU. And I agree. I think I wrote in my postseason sort of player by player wrap ups that there's nobody more important to next winter for IU than Trayce Jackson-Davis.
It's very true. And I've been talking about this. I know that family situations, we don't know. We're not privy to that. So, that aside, I always think unless you're pretty much going to be a lock for a first round pick, why not come back? I understand the COVID situation makes things, it's a variable that no one can really deal with, but that's always been my focus. He's a guy who could come back and be an All-American-like player. He could take that leap. We could look at 18-11, something like that in the Big Ten for Indiana, a historic program. That to me, I think would be an automatic to come back. And I think you can even go the other way, Zach, which is with all this uncertainty, does this mean that, players like Trayce Jackson-Davis, who are sort of on the fringe, are not going to get a fair look because they can't work out and they can't really showcase their skills except for a virtual interview, right?
Right. No, I think that's fair. And it really is something where the more I've thought about the pre-draft process, the more I've wondered if there won't be more kids who just say, I'm 95% guaranteed, 90%, 98% guaranteed to come back anyway. Yes, it would be a beneficial process for me to go through for, my career and my game and to hear input from pro scouts, but there really isn't a process right now. And there's certainly probably going to be a more difficult sort of process for someone like me who, if teams are having to be really judicious about the way they use their time and, the contact that they have with players, and I'm already not, as you talk about kind of targeted in or around that first round, am I going to get a lot out of it? Jackson-Davis had said things, during the season that kind of implied that he was already thinking ahead to next year and that he himself saw, coming back as a pretty viable option for his sophomore season. He's also someone who, when you talk about family, obviously his father is Dale Davis, and his stepfather, whose name suddenly escapes me, played in the NFL. So he's got, he's got a good support system of people who are going to be very familiar with how to be responsible about a career and how to kind of nurture step by step the way you want to make a career really kind of blossom in professional sports. And so I don't think that's ever going to be a huge problem for him either. Again, at this point, I mean, you never want to say absolutely for sure, but it does feel like Indiana's going to have him back. And I think you're right that he could be, he's already this team's most effective rebounder. He's quietly one of the better passing big men in the Big Ten, and that's as a freshman. If he can add any sort of face-up game, then I think his stock as a pro rises rapidly. He was better protecting the rim, frankly, than I thought he would be. Just to be honest with you, this season, I didn't think he was quite, the defensive presence around the rim that he turned out to be. And if he gets better drawing fouls, he's already drawing 5.3 fouls per 40 minutes. Shot almost 170 free throws last season. If he gets better there, it becomes very difficult to manage him, especially when you look around the Big Ten and you see that John Teskey's leaving, Daniel Ituru is leaving, Xavier Tillman is leaving. I don't know if Caleb Wesson has made a decision yet, but Jalen Smith is leaving. And so you just start to, of course, some of those guys will get replaced, but suddenly Trayce Jackson-Davis moves very quickly up the pyramid in terms of best big men in the league. It just makes a lot of sense, I think, at this point for him to come back.
Yeah, stepfather Ray Jackson, who is from the NFL, of course. So yeah, between Dale Davis, Ray Jackson, he's a talented kid with a great pedigree. So absolutely, I think he could come back and have a huge impact. And now next year, which you sort of alluded to this at the beginning of the interview, big year for Archie Miller, year 4. He does have some strong recruits coming in next year who I think can make an immediate impact, couple 4-star guys. So talk about the players who are coming in. Anthony Leal, of course, Jordan Geronimo, Trey Galloway. So players coming in here, can they make an impact next year and sort of right away get this team off to a solid start, which I think year 4 for any coach really is critical.
3 pretty different players. I've only seen Geronimo in highlights. He plays out east. He plays, I think he's actually from New Jersey, but he plays prep ball in New Hampshire. He plays for Mass Rivals, which is obviously a really big AAU outfit out of the Boston area. Also sent Noah Vonleh to Indiana in recent years.
Yeah, sure.
And he's kind of that sort of prototypical developmental wing. He's a guy that I think he's about 6'5", 6'6", played inside a lot because he was playing smaller ball. And then I think when Mass Rivals got a hold of him, they said, if you're going to play on the highest level of the prep circuit, you're going to play as a wing, and we're going to see what you can do. He's got a good shot. He's got good athleticism and explosiveness. A late riser, somebody that picked up a bunch of offers after July last year. And I think a player that, is very much kind of that mold. When I say he's like Victor Oladipo, I want to be clear. I'm not predicting he will turn out to be as good, but when you look for recent comparisons in Indiana's past, a player with a lot of tools, a lot of upside, potential to be really, really good if all those tools can kind of be polished and refined and tapped into. And so if you're Indiana, you're kind of taking him hoping that you can put this, all the variable pieces together and make him into a player that turns out to be very good. The 2 in-state kids, or at least the 2 that are confirmed coming, because there is a third. Anthony Leal's a local kid from Bloomington, goes to Bloomington South, and actually set the Bloomington South scoring record in his senior season. I think very much, if you ask me how I think he projects at the next level, he's kind of a 3-and-D type player in college. He's a good shooter. He's gotten better scoring off the bounce, but even he will acknowledge to you at some level that, where he expects to kind of where he expects to be needed first in college is stretching the floor, shooting the 3. And then from there, if he can do some of that, then a lot of the rest of it comes down to how quickly he can flatten the curve. I guess that's suddenly a phrase that's in all of our minds in day-to-day parlance, but how quickly he can kind of, ride the learning curve defensively. Very much, I think, a 4-year player, a guy that's going to be around for Indiana, kind of for a long time. And then Trey Galloway is his AAU teammate, is the AAU teammate of his that is signed. Galloway is also a guard, but much more kind of, he doesn't shoot the ball as well. He probably puts it on the floor better. He's probably more explosive. I think he can be very good defensively and rebounding for his position as time goes on. He's had some lingering wrist issues in high school that have kind of caused him to, he got his team to a state title as a junior, I think effectively playing with a broken wrist. So there have been parts of his game that he hasn't been able to develop as much like his shot. But I think that he's another one of those guys that if you touch, if you can get all the skills to come together as he gets older, I think he's going to turn out to be a really, really good player. And then the variable fourth option is a kid named Christian Lander, who's also a 2021 commit, played up a year, played AAU ball with Leal and Galloway. Lander is trying to reclassify. Now, obviously, I think he has said even since schools went online and everything kind of shut down that his intention is to try and reclassify. It's hard to know how all this affects him. It's frankly hard to know how all this affects Indiana, because it's possible that he could have more time to figure that out now, because Indiana doesn't know when it's going to have athletes back on campus, doesn't know it's going to have students back on campus, all those sorts of things. But Lander's a top 10 player, number 1 point guard in 2021. He's a little small physically, which, is not surprising. He's only a high school junior. But I think the advantage for Indiana is if you can get him in next year, you still have Rob Finnessy, you still have Al Durham, you still have Armand Franklin, and you've got his 2 AAU teammates. You don't have to, you only have to ask him to be sort of the best version of himself. You don't have to ask him to be a savior in any way. On the nights where he struggles, you can protect him with older guys. On the nights where he's playing well, you can kind of ride the hot hand and just let his talent carve out his role if he can reclassify. And that's kind of the one other big variable for Indiana, is whether or not Lander can get into the 2020 class and join this offseason. Because if he can, I don't think he's necessarily like a one and done type player, but I think he is somebody that very, very rapidly changes Indiana's fortunes for next year.
Yeah, it's a great summary with the players coming in. And like I said, this is a critical year. Zach, you've been great with your time. Just one more question, we'll get you out of here. So next year, if you look at projected starters, Finnessy, Durham, Smith, hopefully Trayce Jackson, Joey Brunk, what do you think reasonable expectations, assuming we have a season coming in next year with those new players that you mentioned, what do you think most Indiana fans are looking at here in year 4, looking for another improvement maybe with Archie Miller? What do you think is sort of the goal?
I think they could be. I think if you're asking me for my April 9th Big Ten favorite, it's pretty clearly Wisconsin. They won a share of the conference last year. The only guy I think they're scheduled to lose is Brevin Pritzel. Obviously, they've lost Kobe King, but they're going to get a lot of really talented players back: Micah Potter, Nate Reavers, Dimitri Trayce, Brad Davis, and Aleem Ford. I think you would expect Wisconsin to be your conference favorite, but then you kind of look for that trailing group and who's in that group that can kind of push Wisconsin, challenge Wisconsin. I think depending on pro decisions, I could see Michigan State in that group. I think I could maybe see Michigan in that group. And I think I could genuinely see Indiana in that group. I don't think it's necessarily a given, but again, when you look at what the fall off is likely to be with, Illinois is losing at this point Kofi Coburn, presumably Iota Sunmu. Maryland's obviously going to take some really big hits. Michigan State's taking some big hits. Michigan loses Xavier Simpson and John Teskey. Those are tough losses. Purdue is a team that I would have thought would have been right in that mix, but now Matt Harms is leaving, and that makes some things a little bit more complicated up in West Lafayette. I don't think I'd sit here and predict Indiana is going to win the Big Ten, but I do think it's a year where if all things remain equal, and certainly if Indiana gets Lander in, you could reasonably say, okay, this is a year where, the bare minimum is top 5 in the conference, top 4 in the conference, somewhere in that range, comfortably in the tournament. If you put a win total on it in the regular season, something like 22, 23, 24 wins, And potentially, if the doors open in mid-late February to make a run at a conference title and Indiana's healthy and put together, then, they're that kind of team as well. But I do think that doesn't just require everybody to come back. That doesn't just require everybody to come back and then to get Christian Lander in. I think that also requires Rob Phinisee to take a step forward, Jerome Hunter to take a step forward, Race Thompson to take a step forward, Al Durham to get comfortable in a couple of different, maybe more high volume roles offensively, as an example. But none of these are, sort of pie in the sky ambitions. If you're talking about Indiana, you're not asking somebody who averaged 3.6 points per game this season to score 18 a game next season. It's basically just, if everybody comes back, if Christian Lander comes in, and all of the principal pieces Indiana would count on take, something roughly approximating the step forward that you would expect them to from one year to the next, I do think Indiana could be a team that makes some noise in the Big Ten. They've got a tough non-conference. They're in the Maui Invitational. They should be on the road in the ACC Big Ten tournament. They'll play Butler in Indianapolis, and then I expect them at this point to have a Big East opponent as well in the Gavitt games, possibly at home. But I think that, that could also be a non-conference schedule that frankly toughens them up a little bit for a Big Ten season that could be a little bit more there for the taking than the last couple have been for the Hoosiers.
Yeah, totally agree. It's a Jenga puzzle, right, Zach? And with the home court advantage that they have and the solid team, I absolutely think that they can be right there. A couple things break the right way. Folks, Zach Osterman covers IU athletics, college sports for the Indiana Star. Follow him on Twitter at Zach Osterman. Does a fantastic job. And, of course, listen to that podcast, Mind Your Banners there. Gives great insight on the Indiana program, one of the storied programs in college basketball. And we really appreciate you, Zach, joining us for a few minutes here, going over the season. And hopefully there will be a season next year, right? And stay safe.
Right.
And hopefully we'll have some good stuff to talk about next year.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
To the appetite, we took a seat in the van.